The water supply situation in Donetsk is getting worse every day. Journalist Denis Kazansky drew attention to a new video from the occupied city. A woman on crutches telling how she is trying to survive in the absence of water. She has had no water at home since the end of May. People are becoming increasingly harsh, demanding that the Russian occupation administration solve the problem. Russia is driving people to strokes and fights in courtyards over water. My neighbor was carrying water. Now he's having a stroke. Now he's a real eggplant. Local residents describe the battle for water. The region officially announced that water is supplied once every 3 to 4 days. But in reality, many houses have had no water at all for months since the beginning of June. The reservoirs are depleted, the pipes are rusty, the infrastructure is in disrepair. Losses during transportation reach 60 to 65%. In some neighborhoods, water is supplied to basements, but it does not reach the upper floors. People walk around with canisters from neighbors and gateways, begging for at least a little. Even Russian military propagandists have admitted that Donetsk has suffered a water supply collapse. The once thriving center of Donbass has turned into a city where old men drag canisters up and down the floors and neighbors fight over a bucket of water. In some houses, the supply is somehow maintained. In others, the tap is completely dry. Despair leads to conflict. People argue and even fight for access to water. Donetsk today looks like a set for a disaster movie. But this is the real life of hundreds of thousands of people. After 11 years of Russian occupation, the once developed and rich region of Ukraine has turned into a humanitarian disaster under Russian rule. Even pro-Kremlin channels are forced to admit Donetsk has become a real bogeyman for all Ukrainians, who now see what the so-called Russian world really is. Now there are claims that Donetsk residents will march on Moscow. This situation is considered a new threat to Putin as it serves to further escalate tensions. Putin's army carried out its attacks in the area of Besalovka, Yunakovka, Alexeyevka, and Varachino. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War have voiced the situation in the Sumy region. A Z-blogger associated with the Sever group stated that units of the 1st Battalion of the 237th Airborne Regiment are experiencing very big difficulties in rotation in Yunakovka. They can leave the eastern outskirts of the settlement only through an open field. At the same time, the military command of the 1434th Regiment continues to involve the still combat-ready Company V in attempts to regain control of previously lost positions in the Varachino area. The Russian blogger also stated that the units of the 83rd Airborne Brigade have become ineffective after a minor advance from the eastern side of Varachino. The brigade simply no longer has reserves for a further offensive. The same unit has also been unsuccessfully attacking Ukrainian armed forces positions on the western outskirts of Yunakovka. The source writes that the occupiers from the 51st Airborne Regiment of the Russian Armed Forces are engaged in remote mining and occupying defensive positions in the Sadkov area. Russian troops have suffered a defeat and lost control of several settlements in the Sumy region, said Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, recently. In the Sumy region, the enemy has suffered a defeat. Despite deploying a powerful force of elite units, paratroopers, marines, and top motorized rifle formations, they failed to achieve any success over the past 2 months, Syrsky said. He added that Russia's latest attempt to advance near Stepne and Novokostiantinivka ended in complete failure. The invaders were destroyed and pushed back across the state border. We're continuing offensive operations in the area. Realizing the futility of their efforts, the enemy is now redeploying units from Sumy to other fronts, primarily Zaporizhia, Syrskyi said. According to him, the situation on the front line is currently very difficult. It is marked by the continuation of Russia's strategic offensive operation. At present, the enemy is regrouping and focusing on two main sectors. The first is the Pokrovsk sector, which remains a key priority for the Russians, and now the enemy is transferring its forces from the Sumy sector to the Zaporizhia direction. In other words, this will be the second axis where they plan to launch active offensive operations, he said.
On the territory of Russia, on the morning of August 28, as a result of an explosion, the infrastructure of the Tver railway junction station was destroyed. Ukrainian media was informed of this by sources in the main directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The attack on the station took place at about 5 a.m. The video that recorded the explosion shows explosives planted under the railway tanks that were standing on the railway tracks and were apparently filled with fuel. A few seconds later, a powerful explosion occurred by remote detonation of the charge. After that, the tanks were engulfed in flames, with the fire subsequently spreading to the entire territory of the railway station, the source reports. As reported by a source in the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense, the attack on the Tver junction station is part of a complex of measures to destroy the logistical capabilities of the aggressor's detachment in supplying the occupation forces with fuel and lubricants, ammunition and personnel. As reported, also on the morning of August 28, the commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Robert Brovdy, Magyar, stated in Telegram that on the night of August 28, the Ukrainian armed forces soldiers destroyed another 4.7% of fuel production in Russia. He noted that the Kuibyshev oil refinery in the Samara region and the Afipsky oil refinery in the Krasnodar region were hit. In total, according to his data, the occupier's oil pump lost weight by 21% in 2 weeks of August 2025. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed this and provided detailed information about the defeat of a number of important facilities of the aggressor country on the night of August 28. It was noted that the units of the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine attacked the Afipsk oil refinery in the Krasnodar region of the Russian Federation. This plant, the main products of which are gasoline and diesel fuel, is involved in supplying the army of invaders. A large-scale fire was recorded on the territory of the facility. In addition, units of the Unmanned Systems Forces and the Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine carried out a fire strike on the Kuibyshev oil refinery in the Samara region of the Russian Federation. The enterprise produces gasoline, diesel fuel, fuel oil, solvents, more than 30 types of oil products in total. The processing capacity is 7 million tons of oil per year. Explosions and a fire were recorded on the territory of the plant.